Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. So, a bunch of us on Twitter saw the massive protests and escalation into the burning of Congress in Guatemala last night. And now it seems to have disappeared from the internet ether and has gained very little traction in most mainstream sources. There's been a bit, but not too much. Now, I'm not going to talk about just Guatemala because it's part of something bigger that has actually been going on since 2019, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, here's the thing. Real quick recap of what's happening in Guatemala. A bunch of students and young people started protests over a proposed budget by the current president of Guatemala, which basically made huge cuts to education and health spending. So it started out as protests, and then when the government wasn't responding to their demands and responded with police brutality, they torched Congress. So that's kind of where we are right now. It's a very tense situation. I hope that people in Guatemala continue to stay as safe as humanly possible in these very difficult times. But I wish them all the best of luck in terms of hopeful success in getting a new budget that actually cares about the people and gives funding towards education and health. So with that out of the way, I want to talk about something that is often ignored in Latin American politics, which is the notion of what are called pink waves and blue waves. And this ties into a lot of American imperialism, which I guess I have to touch on. So, during the Cold War, of course, America hated communism and socialism, and so anything that even remotely smelled like that in Latin America, which America viewed as its natural backyard, it had to immediately snuff out. This is why we had things like the Iran-Contra affair, why Cuba was such a thorn in the side of America for so long. The various dictators in banana republics that were overthrown by corporations and American governments because they wanted to replace exploitative capitalism and neoliberal economics with an actual egalitarian system. Half the time it wasn't even socialism. People were just demanding better conditions, but America said, oh, that sounds like socialism, so this is where you get a lot of governments that would rise to the front and be very conservative and therefore blue. So it was a blue wave of conservatism, which then after an economic cycle or two would retreat as people started to support more left-leaning and centrist policies, hence the pink wave. And this is a gross oversimplification. I could probably do like a week's worth of videos on a lot of this stuff. But this is just the sort of background for what's currently happening in Latin America and why now it's a little different. So in Latin America, right now, we're sort of seeing what's probably the end of a blue wave. The previous pink wave is the one that got a lot of international media attention because it's what brought people like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and ostensibly left-wing governments in Ecuador and Brazil and Uruguay. So it was like, oh, pink wave. Oh. But then we had this sort of blue wave returning against that. And as we've seen also with Brazil and Bolsonaro and the authoritarianism therein, there's of course now a pushback against that. But this has been happening since 2019. A lot of people seem to have either forgotten or just didn't hear about the absolutely massive protests that were happening in 2019. These were massive protests in places like Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala. I think even Nicaragua and Honduras had some pretty sizable protests. There were also not insignificant protests in Brazil as well. But like the other ones that I mentioned, and Chile. Like Chile's were very big, which helped lead to its current revolution that has led to the drafting of a new constitution. The same might be happening again in Peru right now. Peru seems to have slipped completely under everyone's radar. But there's a terrible police brutality crackdown that was happening there in the wake of people protesting, demanding, again, better conditions for the people. And we're seeing that again in Guatemala right now. People demanding better conditions for the people. What's happening that's different this time, though, is before pink waves usually still operated within the realm of a neoliberal order, just with, more social spending, because they knew that if they went too far, America would probably crack down on them. But in the past few decades, as America has retreated from the world stage largely, what's ended up happening is people are getting bolder and braver, and also recognizing that the systems that have been allowed to go on for decades and decades in various Latin American countries are simply not working for people. They're exploitative and cruel, and people are finally pushing back against them, which is why we have seen an uptick in riots, violence, and attempted revolutions in places like Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and to a certain extent, there's murmurs in Mexico. This may be the start of a Latin American spring, but we aren't really thinking of it as such. Unfortunately, Latin America often gets ignored in Western media. And I sort of get why, but I wanted to talk about it today because we only see these little snippets, right? Oh, the people in Paraguay torched their Congress building a few years ago. Oh, look, now that same thing is happening in Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Peru. Like, these are not isolated incidents. And in a time when the left feels like they could use some victories, perhaps it's time to start looking at our allies in Latin America and to start seeing what they have been doing and what has been successful for them and how they have managed to have sustained power and pressure on governments, especially in the cases of Chile and Bolivia. Maybe it's time we look to our south rather than east and west, because there's lots of lessons, both good and bad, that can be taken from this. And I'm tired of the West in general, and especially our media, treating Latin America like some backwater and not part of the same hemisphere that we in North America live in. And I'm also tired of people treating it as one giant collective, as if all of us are all the same and don't have these various differences and aren't experiencing the same struggles and challenges as the rest of the world. And so I think that if we can finally just maybe pay attention and try and learn some lessons and try and connect the dots and realize that there is a movement building in Latin America and that we can learn from that and that we should support that and be paying attention to that, that could be a really good thing. But unfortunately, we aren't paying attention to this, and that is what's bothering me today.